Welcome everyone to this week's video. Today we are on Fish Friday number 220 and we have a very different video for you today. Today's video is going to be about what I do now at my new job, or at least one of my job duties. Now, this is kind of the job duties of all of private consultants now, because remember, I now work for the private sector. I no longer work for the government sector. And the sort of the bread and butter of the private sector is something called wetland delineations. As you can see, I am not at my normal place of business. I actually got called out to work, so I am driving home right now. So I pulled over to the side of the road so that I could get you your video. And I thought it would be really neat and people might be interested in what I'm doing currently. Now, I no longer do as much fish work as I would like. My old job in the government sector, there's a lot more leeway to do like government research and things like that. Now with the private sector, obviously we are hired by clients and we are, asked to do these things. And like I said, the sort of the bread and butter of the private world is something called wetland delineations. And it's a very important topic. So I thought maybe it's a very interesting thing and maybe y'all would be interested in it. But the first thing that we need to discuss is, what is a wetland? And it sounds like a simple concept, but it's actually kind of complex. A wetland is a very distinct sort of semi-aquatic ecosystem that is quite possibly one of the most diverse ecosystems on the planet. Plants are different, everything's different. It's very similar to something we've talked about in the past called the riparian zone. But wetlands have their own sort of unique values. And a wetland serves many biological purposes. A lot of animals use riparian zones for breeding habitat, especially many birds. It provides a very dense, nutrient-rich vegetation strata that herbivores really love. Allows them to get a lot of nutrients very quickly. It provides, in terms of geologic, a lot of wetlands serve as sort of carbon sinks and nutrient sinks, meaning the soils are highly anoxic and the plants have adaptations that allow them to survive in these very anoxic soil, very oxygen poor soils, because usually these soils are waterlogged or they're periodically flooded, and very oftentimes they're usually standing waters. So wetlands are highly important, and I encourage you to go do your own research on what a wetland is, because it's almost worth its own video on what an actual wetland is. But today I kind of want to talk about what I've been doing, which is what is called a wetland delineation, where we go out and we determine if an area is a wetland and where is the boundary of that wetland. And it's important to note that a wetland must meet 3 separate criteria. It must have hydric soils, it must have hydrology indicators, and it must have hydrophytic vegetation. And how these things are arrived are each have their own separate sort of methodology from them. So hydrology indicators are separated into what are called primary and secondary indicators. And a primary indicator is something like a very high water table. So every wetland point you have to go dig what is called a soil pit. And if you dig in that soil pit and there is high water table, I believe it's within 12 inches, it is considered a primary hydrology indicator. And you only need one primary hydrology indicator. Now, the secondary indicators, you need 2 to meet the criteria. Your secondary indicators are going to be things like geomorphic position, crayfish burrows, FAC neutral test, which we'll get into a bit. And there's many others, and it very much depends on which region you are. And again, this is going to be a very broad overview of wetland delineations. There's much more specifics that if people are interested in, I'll do another video as like a special Fish Friday and go from there to talk more about it. But they're very, very specific in what they do. So those are your hydrology indicators. So they either meet or they don't. You either have one primary, at least one primary, or at least two secondaries. Now you can have multiple of them. So if you can have 6, 7, 11 secondary indicators and 2 primaries, that doesn't matter. It doesn't, change the fact it's either one primary or 2 secondaries. As soon as you do that, it's always good to document if other indicators are very obvious or present, but it's not necessarily needed. So the next thing that we do after hydrology indicators is we usually then look at the vegetation. And this is usually one of the more scientific parts of a wetland delineation. And what you have to do is you look at the vegetation stratum around you, and you'll have a tree stratum, a shrub stratum, a herb stratum, and then a woody vine stratum, which means are there trees around you? Yes or no. Are there shrubs around you? Yes or no. Are there herbs around you? Yes or no. And are there woody vines around you? Yes or no. And if any of those are yes, you have to identify that plant. And it's not just, oh, that's a tree. You have to know exactly which species of tree. It's not, oh, that's a grass. You have to know which species of grass. And that's very important, because you have to know the species of the plants that you're around and that you're working with, because not every species, but almost every species of plant in the United States have what is called an indicator status. It's either going to be, the indicator statuses are broken up into 6 separate categories. There's upland, there's facultative upland, facultative wet, and obligatory species. And then there's the no indicator, which no indicators are treated as upland plants. So obviously upland plants are not really associated with wetlands. It does not mean that they can't be found in a wetland. It just means that I believe upland plants 95% of the time are not found in a wetland. Facultative uplands are 75% of the time found in uplands, 25% can be found in wetlands. Facultative plants they just they'll grow wherever the heck they want, wherever they can. Facultative wet, I believe, is 75% found in wet areas, 25% in uplands. And I could be wrong on these percentages. Do not hold me to those percentages. And then there's obligatory species, which basically 99% of the time, these are going to be in wetlands. And so you have to identify each species around you, or at least the absolute most common species around you. For instance, if there's a single plant, and these are all looked at in an area around you. So for trees, you look at an area, what are the trees within 30 feet of my point? In shrubs, it's what are these shrubs within 15 feet of my point? Herbs are what is 5 feet around me. And that's a generalist thing. I mean, it's not like you take a tape measure and you say, oh, this is 5 feet, so ignore everything over there. It's more of a generalistic sort of deal. It's saying, oh, don't look, 100 feet away and be like, oh, there's some herbs over there, I need to go ID. No. And even within that 5-foot area, if there's literally one tiny little flower, it's still good to document. And if you know the species, you can document it, but it's not near as important as saying, okay, you really want to ID the 6 to 7 most common species around your area, which when you start learning the different types of grasses and everything, actually can be very, very you can reach that 7 species fairly quickly, especially in a wetland area. So not only do you identify the types of species, you identify how much of the area they're covering. Because once you get into that, and when I say area, I'm saying like this plant occupies 25% of the herbaceous stratum. And so, you know, it's like that's a pretty dominant species in this area. And once you get all the species and all the percentages, you used to, in the olden days, have to keep a paper record of the species and then go back and cross-reference them to figure out what their indicator status is. But now, thanks to the glories of technologies, there's a ton of applications out there and lists that will basically make your life easy and auto-populate what the status is. And that allows you to, it allows things to go much, much faster. And then once you get all that, there's basically 3 chances to determine if the vegetation in your spot is actually hydrophytic vegetation. There's the fact neutral test, there is dominance hydrophytic vegetation, dominance obligatory, and I believe there's one more. I don't 100% know the calculations or the numbers on that one, because, and this is a little more my fault, the apps that people use nowadays in doing wetland delineations kind of make it, they auto-populate and auto-calculate based on the percentages and everything. They basically auto-populate. And if it meets one of those criteria, you do have hydrophytic vegetation. So you have wetland hydrology indicators, you have hydrophytic vegetation, then you have to take a soil profile. And that's where the soil pit comes into play. So you dig a hole and you pull out essentially a plug of soil, try and keep it as intact as possible, and you then look at that soil and determine what the color, and well, it's called the chroma and the value, which is essentially you're looking at the soil and you're saying this is what color it is. And there's a book that can be used called the Munsell Handbook of Soil Colors that you would use to look at and determine the actual soils colors in there. And it sounds easy, and it is kind of easy, but it's actually a little more challenging than you might think, because there's shades, there's a lot of different color variations. So once you get your soil color, then you have to determine if there's redox in there, which redox is essentially the oxidization of iron in the soils. Iron is one of the most common minerals in soils in the world. And so what happens when iron gets wet? It rusts. And that holds true in soils. So you look in the soils, you break it open and you look very closely, and you'll actually see little bits of rust. And you have to determine what percent is soil, what percent is rust, and then you also have to look at the color of the redox concentrations, which would be, you know, what color is that rust color, which you can also use the book for. And based on the color of the soil, the percent of the redox, and there's a whole bucket list of different soil characteristics that you look at, because you also look at the texture of the soil. Is it a clay? Is it a fine sandy clay? Is it a loamy clay? Is it clay loam? Is it very fine sand and there's no clay? Is it just loam? Is it silt? Like, there's a lot that goes into the soils. It's not as difficult as I'm making it seem once you get hands-on experience. But once you get the hands-on experience, you really start understanding like okay, this is what I'm feeling for, this is what I'm looking for, and things like that. So based on all these colorations, then you say, okay, it is a blank soil, like an F3 soil, which I believe is what is called a depleted matrix, or it's a redox start surface if it's a darker soil. But essentially, you take your percentages and your colors, and there is a cheat sheet that you can use to get like what the soil is, and like, is it a hydric soil or is it not? And it can be very challenging because some of them, it's like, okay, if it's like, I believe if it's a 4-3, not a 4-3, a 4-2 soil, it must have at least 5% redox in it. So 5% of redox concentrations. So now you have to be like, okay, is this more or less than 5%? Does it meet 5%? So, you know, is it, but I called it 4% originally. Am I being a little conservative, or am I being a little extra? Is this sort of area operating biologically as a wetland? Is it not operating as a wetland? So you have to kind of just, you know, figure out, you know, the best and get it there. And this is where experience really comes into play, is getting that soil down. Like the vegetation I used, because I had plenty of vegetation experience from my old job, but the soils is very new to me, so I'm trying my best to learn as much as possible soils. And it is one of those things that was a little daunting at first, but once you learn it, and you don't necessarily have to do all this in the field. Like if you know this area is a wetland, but you don't know the hydric soil indicators, you can record your soil colors and your redox concentrations, and then be like, I know it's a hydric soil. What is the hydric soil indicator classification? And then once you do that, okay, now I know it's a wetland. This point makes it a wetland. Now I have to map the boundary of the wetland. And mapping the boundary can be a little tricky depending on where you are in the United States. And that, you know, you're basically finding where the edge of the wetland is, which a lot of times you have to use the shovel still to find the edges on where the roots are no longer doing what is called an oxidizing rhizosphere, which is essentially, I don't know, that may be another video, but you basically find the edge of the wetland where everything changes, where it's no longer acting as a wetland, and you map the boundary, and then now you have your point, you have your wetland, and go from there. And then you have to take an upland point associated with the wetland, meaning you have to go to somewhere that's not operating as a wetland and dig another soil pit, do the same vegetation and everything, and you can go from there. But it's important to note that it takes all three criteria to make a wetland. So where we have been working at recently, the vegetation doesn't necessarily change too much between wetland and upland. And very often soils may still meet as a hydric soil. So we have to depend a lot on those hydrological indicators. For instance, you do not have geomorphic position if you're outside of a floodplain. If you're outside of a floodplain, chances are it's not going to be inundated very often. But you're still going to have the vegetation, meaning you're going to meet the FAC neutral test. So very often, a lot of our upland points in our area, they'll have one secondary hydrologic indicator, but they won't have the second. So there's a little bit of talking. You got to really play the field on this. But I just wanted to give everyone a very broad overview on what wetland delineations are, what we do. I will do another video in the future on the importance of wetlands and how wetlands operate biologically. But I do believe that's a video for another time, because we've already had a very long Fish Friday video. But thank you guys so much again. I really appreciate it. Hope to see you again. If you'd like to support the channel, please click the link down below. It is by no means expected, but very much appreciated. Regardless, please leave a like, comment, and subscribe, and take care of yourselves, take care of your loved ones. I'm gonna get back on the road to go see my loved ones, and peace.